They came without warning. A fleet larger than any human had ever seen, blocking out the stars. The Zorvith Dominion, an empire forged in endless conquest, had arrived at Earth. They did not demand surrender. They did not negotiate. They simply broadcast their declaration of war. Humanity, you are but insects before giants. We are the Zorvith. We have crushed civilizations beyond counting. You will not resist. You cannot resist. You will kneel, or you will burn. The message played on every screen, every device, every frequency. For the first time in centuries, Earth stood united not in fear, but in silent understanding. The invaders thought this would be easy, that humans would break like so many others before them. They had no idea what they had just unleashed. In a war room buried beneath Geneva, the United Earth Defense Council convened. Generals, strategists, and world leaders sat in grim silence as the Zorvith fleet loomed overhead. We should reach out, one diplomat suggested. Appeal to reason. General Carter leaned forward, his expression unreadable. Reason? They don't want peace. They want submission. His voice was like stone. We don't have time for diplomacy. We prepare for war. Against them. A younger officer gestured at the monstrous fleet hovering in orbit. That's suicide. Carter's lips curled into something between a smirk and a snarl. Only if you don't know history. The Zorvith thought they were the pinnacle of warfare, that their size, strength, and technology made them unbeatable. They had never fought humans. They had never faced a species that had made war an art. For millennia, humanity had waged war upon itself, perfecting it in ways no other species ever had. From blades of bronze to nuclear fire, from trenches of mud to battles in the void, war was not just survival. It was part of human nature, and if the Zorvith wanted to test them, they would learn that lesson the hard way. On the bridge of the Zorvith command vessel, Supreme Warlord Xareth observed the planet below with cold amusement. The humans were quiet. No desperate pleas. No reckless attacks. It was strange. Most civilizations panicked, sent fleets in futile charges, begged for mercy. These creatures simply watched. Why do they not respond? One of his advisors asked. Are they truly so weak? Xareth let out a low, rumbling chuckle. They are in shock. They know their end is near. We begin the assault immediately. He raised a clawed hand, signaling his fleet. Thousands of landing craft broke from the armada, descending toward Earth's surface. The Zorvith did not expect resistance. There was nothing these frail creatures could do. They had crushed species with interstellar empires, shattered fleets that dwarfed anything humans possessed. A single planet stood no chance. The first wave landed on what the humans called Europe. Vast open fields, ancient cities, and rivers that had once run red with blood. The Zorvith forces emerged from their transports, massive warriors clad in armor stronger than steel, wielding weapons that could burn through tanks in seconds. They advanced in formation, disciplined, confident. And then the first explosion tore through their ranks. It wasn't a direct attack. It was a trap, hidden charges buried beneath their landing zones. The ground erupted, swallowing dozens of Zorvith soldiers in flame and shrapnel. Then the gunfire began. From ruined buildings, forests, and trenches the Zorvith never saw, humans struck with terrifying precision. Snipers punched through the weak points in their armor. Heavy artillery rained death from miles away. Their communications jammed, their scanners useless. The Zorvith were powerful, but they were used to open combat, to enemies who fought in straightforward battles. They had never faced this kind of warfare. Guerrilla tactics, psychological warfare, deception. The humans were ghosts, striking and vanishing before the Zorvith could retaliate. They fell back, regrouped, advanced again, only to be funneled into another kill zone. A veteran Zorvith commander roared into his communicator. These primitives fight like cowards. A voice responded, not Zorvith, but human. Calm. Steady. We fight like history taught us. The commander's confusion lasted only seconds before another blast ripped through his unit. In orbit, Xareth watched the reports flood in. He frowned. This was not right. The humans were supposed to crumble. Instead, they were dismantling his first wave. How is this possible? An aide hesitated before responding. They are using unconventional tactics. Their knowledge of war is extensive. Xarath snarled. Then we send more troops. Overwhelm them with numbers. The aide hesitated. With respect, warlord, we have never needed more troops before. Xarath's eyes narrowed. For the first time, doubt crept into his mind. But he silenced it. No species had ever resisted them for long. These humans would be no different. He turned back to the display, watching his forces regroup. Watching as the humans disappeared into the shadows. And for the first time in his long life, he felt something he did not recognize. Unease. The second wave landed in force. This time, the Zorvith did not spread their troops thin. Instead, they concentrated their warriors into massive strike groups. Overwhelming numbers and firepower brought to bear on key human strongholds. If the humans wanted to fight from the shadows, then the Zorvith would simply burn every shadow to the ground. Cities turned to war zones. Streets once filled with life became killing fields. The Zorvith advanced through ruined buildings, firing indiscriminately, tearing through anything that moved. Human defenses crumbled under the sheer brutality of the assault. Civilians fled. The lines began to break. And yet, something felt wrong. The Zorvith were winning, but they were not winning fast enough. Every inch they gained was paid for in blood. Human resistance should have shattered by now. Instead, it adapted, adjusted, learned. Zorvith squads were funneled into alleys and crossroads where they became easy targets. Entire armored columns were led into false safe zones, only to be hit with mines, artillery, and ambush teams that struck before vanishing into underground tunnels. The humans fought with a ruthless efficiency that was unnerving. They never engaged in direct, unwinnable battles. Instead, they exploited every weakness, every oversight, every mistake. Zorvith commandos stormed a city block, expecting a prolonged engagement. Instead, the buildings around them collapsed in a perfectly orchestrated demolition. Snipers fired through the dust and debris, taking them down one by one. Elsewhere, a heavily armed Zorvith squad breached a human defensive line, expecting a desperate last stand. Instead, the defenders were gone. The trenches empty, the bunkers abandoned. Confused, the Zorvith pressed forward, right into a pre-planned artillery strike that annihilated their entire force. They weren't fighting soldiers. They were fighting ghosts. A Zorvith captain sent an urgent transmission back to command. His voice, normally filled with confidence, carried something else now. They are everywhere, and nowhere. Every street, every building, every ruin. It's all a trap. Every move we make, they anticipate. Every strategy we deploy, they counter. They are not fighting us. They are hunting us. In the command ship above, Xarath listened. His jaw tightened. This was not possible. The humans should have broken under a direct assault. They had no interstellar empire, no fleets to match the Dominion. Their weapons were inferior, their technology primitive. And yet, for the first time in Zorvith history, the invasion was not going as planned. Xarath turned to his advisors. Explain this. One of them hesitated. Warlord, the humans are not fighting like the others. They have studied war, perfected it. Ridiculous. Every species studies war. The advisor hesitated before answering. Not like this. Xarath's gaze darkened. They had conquered hundreds of worlds, wiped out entire civilizations that had fought with everything they had. And yet none had fought like this. None had adapted so quickly. The reports continued. Ambushes, traps, psychological tactics designed to instill fear. Entire Zorvith regiments disappearing without a trace. Units refusing to advance because of the terror gripping them. The humans were turning the war into something ugly. Something the Zorvith were not used to. Something they were not prepared for. For the first time, Xarath felt something stir in his chest. A feeling he had never known before. Doubt. Xarath stood alone in the silent chamber, staring at the endless casualty reports that scrolled across the hollow display. The numbers were staggering. They told a story of relentless attrition, of warriors once feared across the galaxy now dying in droves. His fists trembled with a mix of rage and something else, something he refused to acknowledge as fear. Supreme Warlord. A voice broke through the stillness. An aide, eyes filled with dread, dared to speak. Our forward bases on the western continent have gone dark. There was no distress signal. Sabotage. Worse, they knew our rotation schedules, our security protocols. They cut power, jammed communications, and slaughtered entire battalions before we could mobilize reinforcements. Xarath clenched his jaw, refusing to believe that the humans had penetrated their lines so deeply. This kind of precision, this intimate understanding of warfare, where had it come from? They were primitives, barely capable of interstellar travel. Deploy the elite guard. I want those vermin crushed. They already engaged, Warlord. None survived. The words hung between them, heavy and unyielding. Xarath turned away, eyes fixed on the pale blue planet that had become his obsession. Send a message to their leaders. Demand unconditional surrender. The aide shifted uncomfortably. We tried. Their only reply was more history. Xarath watched the recording. Grainy footage of ancient battles, of human cities burning, of soldiers fighting with nothing but scraps and fury against overwhelming odds. The last scene showed a small force defending a bridge against an army, holding their ground until the very end. We will fight you in the streets, a voice narrated. In the hills, on the seas, and in the skies. We will never surrender. Propaganda, Xarath spat, but the words felt hollow. The bridge shuddered as a muffled blast echoed through the command ship. Alarms flared, and reports flooded in. Boarding parties. They've breached the lower decks. Xarath roared. Impossible. We hold orbit. Their fleet is in ruins. The aide's eyes darted. It wasn't a fleet. They launched from the surface ballistic missiles modified for boarding. We dismissed the launch as debris. Fury boiled into panic as Xarath raced to the central console, monitoring feeds from the lower decks. Grainy visuals showed human soldiers cutting through Zorvith elite, their movements sharp, methodical, no hesitation, no mercy. One human stood over a fallen Zorvith captain, helmet visor reflecting the flicker of emergency lights. You brought war to our home, the soldier said, voice distorted but steady. We've been perfecting it for 10,000 years. Xarath snarled. Seal the bulkheads. Vent the decks. Before the order could execute, the lights dimmed, replaced by the crimson glow of emergency power. Human saboteurs had already compromised the systems. Internal defenses turned on Zorvith personnel, turrets cutting down their own in a storm of fire. The warlord's comm blared, dozens of commanders screaming conflicting orders. They were crumbling, their discipline shattered. Xarath shut it off, gripping the command console so hard his claws splintered the surface. A single message blinked onto the main screen. Surrender or face extinction. Xarath roared in defiance, smashing the console. I will not bow to lesser creatures. But the proof was undeniable. They weren't fighting an enemy outmatched by technology or strength. They were fighting a species that had turned survival against itself into an art form. A species that learned, adapted, and would rather burn the universe than submit. The bridge doors burst open, and Xarath spun to face the squad of humans who stormed inside. Their weapons trained on him, unflinching. End it, the lead soldier commanded. Xarath's shoulders sagged. His warriors were gone, his fleet crippled, his legacy turned to ash by beings he had dismissed as weak. The truth he'd denied stared him down. Humanity wasn't just fighting for survival. They were fighting to prove a point, that no force, no matter how strong, could crush the will of a species forged in endless struggle. He dropped to a knee, a gesture of surrender that felt like poison in his veins. What are you? The human stepped closer, lowering the rifle just enough to meet his gaze. A reminder that strength is more than muscle and steel. It's memory, sacrifice, and the refusal to ever be conquered again. Xarath closed his eyes, hearing the echo of battles lost, the screams of those who'd trusted in his might. The strongest species in the universe had wanted war. Humanity had given them history, and in history the conquerors who forgot struggle were always the first to fall. The war should have been over. The Zorvith had never fought this long against a single planet. The humans should have surrendered, broken, or fled. But they hadn't. They fought harder, smarter, more ruthlessly. And for the first time, the Zorvith were no longer advancing. They were stalling. Entire regiments refused to move into urban areas without overwhelming fire support. Their forward bases were under constant attack, not by large armies, but by small, well-coordinated human strike teams that infiltrated under the cover of darkness and destroyed supplies, vehicles, and communications. Every attempt to establish control ended in chaos. Occupied zones became nightmares. Civilians were never truly unarmed. Bombings, ambushes, assassinations, no Zorvith officer was safe. Entire command structures collapsed under relentless, invisible pressure. The humans didn't just resist. They made occupation impossible. Zorvith warriors, once fearless conquerors, were now afraid to patrol in groups smaller than a battalion. Supply convoys moved only in armored formations, yet still disappeared between cities. Rumors spread among the troops, of enemy snipers who never missed, of mines that appeared where there had been none, of entire platoons being led into death traps by seemingly surrendering humans. Morale plummeted. Soldiers began questioning orders. Some outright refused to fight. The Zorvith had never faced an enemy like this. It was one thing to fight a stronger opponent. It was another to fight one that refused to die. Xaratha's war council was in shambles. Generals bickered over strategy. Advisors whispered of retreat. An unthinkable act for a species that had never lost a war. Reports detailed a grim reality. Their forces were not just being defeated. They were being broken. Then, a new message was broadcast, this time from the humans. You thought we would kneel, that we would break. But you have learned nothing. We are not the first to face annihilation. We have fought against impossible odds before. We have bled for every inch of our existence. We have burned, suffered, and endured. And yet we stand. The Zorvith did not understand it at first. They had destroyed countless civilizations before. None had resisted like this. None had fought like this. Then the realization set in. The humans were not just defending themselves. They were teaching the Zorvith a lesson written in blood. There was no official declaration, no grand ceremony. The war simply stopped. What remained of the once invincible Zorvith fleet abandoned their positions, breaking formation and fleeing into deep space. On the ground, the once dominant warriors laid down their weapons, their glowing war banners torn and discarded in the dirt. The Zorvith dominion, undefeated for centuries, had not just lost. It had been broken. For humanity, the end was neither a moment of celebration nor relief. It was just another chapter in the long, brutal history of war. The cities still smoldered. The dead still lay in the ruins. And for those who had fought, there was no satisfaction, only exhaustion. Among them stood Captain Elias Voss, watching as the last remnants of the Zorvith occupation forces were rounded up. Their towering forms, once so terrifying, now seemed small. He had seen them slaughter civilians, torch entire towns, fight without mercy. And yet, looking at them now, stripped of their weapons, hollow-eyed, defeated, he understood what had happened. The Zorvith had never learned how to lose. They had conquered, pillaged, and destroyed, but they had never been forced to endure, to claw their way back from the brink, to fight with nothing but grit and desperation. Humanity had lived in the shadow of war for thousands of years. They had burned, bled, rebuilt, and burned again. Every scar was a lesson, every loss a foundation, and that was why they had won. A transmission flickered onto his wrist display. The United Earth Command. They were already shifting to the next phase, rebuilding, reinforcing, preparing for the possibility of another war. Voss exhaled. There was always another war. He glanced at the captured Zorvith warlord Xarath, once the supreme commander of a galactic invasion force, now kneeling in chains. The alien's gaze was distant, haunted. as if still processing the impossible. Voss crouched down. You still don't understand, do you? Xaratha's eyes flicked up, but he said nothing. We never should have won, Voss continued. By every metric, you should have crushed us. You had the technology, the numbers, the advantage. Xarath finally spoke, his voice hollow. You were weak. You still are. Voss smirked. Weak? Maybe. But weakness forces something strength never does. He tapped the side of his head. It forces you to think, to adapt, to survive. Xaratha's fists clenched, the old warrior's pride warring with the reality before him. You were supposed to kneel. Voss shook his head. We don't kneel. We never have. Silence stretched between them. The war was over, but Xarath knew something Voss did not yet realize. This loss would shatter the Zorvith dominion. It would send ripples through the stars. Other species would see the truth, that the unconquerable could fall, that the gods of war could bleed, and that humanity, a species born from fire and ruin, had done what no other had before. Xarath finally lowered his head, not in submission but in understanding. The strongest species in the universe had wanted war, and humanity had given them history. The aftermath of the war was not clean. There was no moment of pure victory, no neat conclusion. Humanity had survived, but survival was never without cost. The cities that had stood for centuries were reduced to skeletal ruins. The fields that once fed millions were scorched and barren. The air was thick with the scent of fire and death. But the humans did what they had always done. They began to rebuild. The remnants of the Zorvith forces were herded into secured zones, stripped of their weapons, their armor, their pride. Some stared blankly at the ground, unable to comprehend their defeat. Others glared with hatred, their fists clenched in useless defiance. They had been raised to believe in their own supremacy. The idea that they could be beaten by humans of all creatures was unthinkable. Among the prisoners was General Xarath, once the most feared warlord in the Dominion. He had commanded fleets that had razed planets. He had crushed empires beneath his heel. And yet here he was shackled, forced to watch as the so-called weaklings buried their dead and rebuilt their world. A human officer approached, a woman, tall, scarred, her uniform still stained with battle. She looked down at Xarath, arms crossed, eyes cold. You still don't get it, do you? She said. Xarath remained silent. There was nothing left to say. The officer crouched, meeting his gaze. We saw your kind coming a long time ago. Not you specifically, but something like you. It was always going to happen. A species that believed itself invincible, that thought war was just a tool for power. She gestured around them. But we don't see war like you do. To you, it's conquest. To us, it's survival. Xarath scoffed. Survival means knowing when to submit. She shook her head. Not for us. For us, survival means fighting, no matter how impossible the odds. You invaded our world thinking you were fighting a species that had never known true war. But we were born from it, shaped by it. Xarath clenched his jaw. And what now? You've won your war. Do you think this victory will last? The officer stood. You don't get it. It's not about victory. It never was. You thought winning meant crushing us under your boots. For us, winning just meant making sure we were still standing at the end. She turned to leave, pausing only once. Your people will remember this war as the first time they lost. We'll remember it as just another fight we survived. As she walked away, Xarath felt something he had never experienced before. Not just defeat, not just humiliation, fear, not of death, not of imprisonment, but of what he had awakened. The strongest species in the universe had come seeking war, and humanity had given them something far worse, a lesson they would never forget.